Happy Sunday, everyone. Hope you're all doing great. Today we're talking about something that the Book of Mormon is missing. Now, that probably doesn't sound too crazy, I hope, because the authors of the records that became the Book of Mormon themselves state on several occasions that they were leaving out many things, that they couldn't record, the 100th part of all the comings and goings of their people and the things that were happening and that they had witnessed, right? Mormon himself, in compiling the record, is saying the same thing. Of course, we've got the lost 116 pages as well that we're missing, that therefore you could say the Book of Mormon is missing. We're missing the sealed portion. So there's lots we're missing. But what I am actually referring to today is an omission that I think we have to read through the lines a little bit to try and understand what was actually happening. First, the context. So I've been working on a book that is going to come out later this year called The Slow Stain, tentatively. And I'm going to try and release it on the 30th anniversary of when the Proclamation on the Family was read for the first time in the Relief Society session of the October 1995 General Conference. So this October makes 30 years, so I'm trying to publish it on the 30th anniversary. And so I've been thinking through, I should then tell you, right before reading the proclamation, President Hinckley remarks at how one of the reasons they were sharing it and did that proclamation was that because of the propensity of people to take on, quote, the slow stain of the world. Now, that's not the first time he had said it. He had said it on one other occasion before then in some like area conference or regional leaders conference or something like that. But I found and find that phrase fascinating, the slow stain of the world. So I'm working on this book, looking at historical examples of the slow stain of the world, and then I'm going to discuss modern ones, what the slow stain today looks like, not just on issues pertaining to the family, but far broader than that as well. So on the historical side, as I've been working on this book, certainly I'm talking about the children of Israel and all of the apostasy and idolatry, because they're constantly surrounded by, pagan societies. They're intermarrying, they're intermingling, they're immigrating, and all these things, and they find themselves again and again incorporating the religious beliefs and rites and rituals and feasts and temples and altars and all the things of these gods, and they're weaving them into their religion. This is well known, right? Certainly in 1 Samuel 8, when they say we want a king like all the nations, right? They're rejecting God as their king, and they want to be like everyone else. They all have kings protecting them. We want a king too, right? So that's all well understood. Well, then I'm working on the Book of Mormon, and I'm giving all these examples with the Jaredites and the Nephites. And then, and I haven't given thought to this topic in quite a number of years, but it jogged my memory of going down the rabbit hole years ago and really thinking of this question of who else was here in addition to, the Jaredites and the Mulekites and the Lehiites, because if we are talking about the slow stain of the world and the propensity that God's people have to be affected by other ideas and people around them, I was thinking, okay, well, if it's the Nephites, let's say it's the Nephites we're talking about, what is their slow stain of the world? What were they dealing with? Now, you could certainly say it was apostate Nephites who were embracing secret combinations. The adversary was directly kind of enticing them. They were then dissenting, joining with the Lamanites, and then attacking the Nephites. So you might say that the Nephites' slow stain of the world was their own kind of corrupt cousins and others fighting against them. But I think that misses the mark. That's the wrong way to say it. I think that's incomplete, because I believe that the Nephites dealt with the same, and Jaredites for that matter, dealt with the same problems that the Israelites did, and that is surrounding cultures and their influences. Now, this is something that doesn't get a lot of airtime, probably because you have to read between the lines and there's lots of inferences and speculation that comes into play, but that's what I want to talk about in today's musing, to have you consider the possibility that the Book of Mormon is not actually a history of all the people who lived in, say, North and South America, that it's only an account of what it claims to be, which is these few groups of people who inhabited a particular portion of the Promised Land. Nowhere does it claim, for example, that the Jaredites were the first human beings on the continent. Here's a quote that I found and enjoyed from Hugh Nibley. He says, "Just because Lehi's people have come from Jerusalem by special direction, we are not to conclude that other men cannot have had the same experience. And by the same token, the fact that the Jaredites were led to the land of promise at the time of the dispersion gives us no right to conclude that no one else was ever so led, either earlier or later than they. It is nowhere said or implied that even the Jaredites were the first to come here, any more than it is said or implied that they were the first or only people to be led from the tower. Now, there is a great deal said in the Book of Mormon about the past and future of the Promised Land, but never is it described as an empty land. The descendants of Lehi were never the only people on the continent, and the Jaredites never claimed to be. So provocative, right? Really interesting to contemplate, okay, maybe there were other people here, and this isn't totally out of left field. It's been mentioned in the past by various church leaders, infrequently, I should point out. Here, as one example, is April 1929 General Conference, a member of the First Presidency, Anthony Ivins, who encouraged the saints to be careful in the conclusions that we reach about this topic. He continued, and I quote, "The Book of Mormon teaches the history of three distinct peoples, or two peoples and three different colonies of people, who came from the Old World to this continent. It does not tell us that there was no one here before them. It does not tell us that people did not come after. And so if discoveries are made which suggest differences in race origins, it can very easily be accounted for, and reasonably, for we do believe that other people came to this continent." A decade later, one of the apostles, John Widsoe, he wrote about the three primary groups that were recorded. Of course, we're talking about the Jaredites, the Mulekites, and the Lehi's descendants. And he stated, quote, "There may also have been others not recorded in the book or not known to the ancient authors." A few years later, another apostle published something under the approval of the First Presidency, a statement that described the Book of Mormon as, quote, "part of a record, both sacred and secular, of prophets and peoples who, with supplementary groups, were among the ancestors of the American Indians." Okay, supplementary groups, right? Others. And suddenly I think the slow stain of the world makes way more sense in its influence in the New World. If we realize that God's people, like with Israel, were surrounded by competing cultures, each with their different, idolatrous influences. It wasn't just Laman and Lemuel's descendants that were, badgering the Nephites constantly. I think, like the Israelites, each of these groups, the Jaredites and the Nephites and so forth, had to navigate operating in a society full of people with totally conflicting worldviews. I think if we break down each of the stories, to me at least, it makes a little more sense. Let's start with the Jaredites. So here's a group of several families: Jared's family, the brother of Jared's family, and then some friends and family of theirs with their families. And they cram into 8 small barges. Now, the scripture says they're small, tight like unto a dish, right? It could have been small by comparison to some massive ship. So it could be one family with all their provisions would fit in each small barge. Could be 5, could be 20. We don't quite know, right? But some smallish number of Jaredites come over. And then between when they settled in the Promised Land, all the way fast forward to when Coriantumr is the last one and Ether is witnessing it, right? The prophesied destruction of the Jaredite people. It's about 2,000 years roughly, and about 35-ish generations. In the first chapter of Ether lists his lineage. So-and-so was the son of so-and-so, who was the son of so-and-so, all the way up to Jared. And there's 30 names listed, except what's interesting is if you read where Ether is talking about this, in verse 6, it says that Ether was a descendant of Coriantumr. And then from Coriantumr, it goes, he was the son of this person, who was the son of this person. So it says son for all 30 of these, except for Ether, it says he was a descendant. So I'm thinking, okay, maybe there's like he's not his immediate father. He's like a near distant relative. So I'm guessing around like 35 generations, maybe add an extra 5. And then, of course, throughout the Jaredite record, we have frequent wars and famine and poisonous serpents decimating the population. So they're probably having a bunch of kids because they don't have birth control, and not all the kids are living to old age because it's a rough environment, both just on its own, but then also all the wars and problems and things. So you got a high mortality rate. And I think those things likely suggest that a population like that would really struggle to kind of exponentially take off even over 2,000 years. Because if you look at the numbers, if you avoid all the mortality and death and war and famine, and you just say all of those initial families each had on average, let's say 5 kids, and then 75% of the next generation end up marrying and procreating, and then extrapolate that across 35 generations, you end up with like many, many, many millions, sometimes billions of people based on your assumptions, which is ridiculous because there was war and death and famine and all these things that was just repeatedly culling the population. So I think it's my position that it would be very difficult for a society like that to significantly grow with all of these repeating events that were just cutting down the population. And yet, the destruction that Coriantumr witnessed in this final battle involved, he says, 2 million of mighty men and also their wives and their children. So let's assume that just half of the men were married, roughly, right? And let's say each of those married men on average had like 4 children. That's 7 million total people that are dying just in that final battle, right? And so that's a ton of people in this massive genocide. So with numbers that large, to me, the more plausible scenario is not that it was their own Jaredite self-contained society of birth, death, more births, more death, calamities, and so forth, but that along the way there were surrounding people into which they were intermarrying and joining and growing their society more to then reach such significant numbers 2,000 years down the road. What about the Mulekites? Here, Hugh Nibley has an interesting quote. He says, the idea of other migrations to the New World is taken so completely for granted that the story of the Mulekites is dismissed in a few verses. So he's saying like it's not this like crazy thing. They pass over it almost, which seems to suggest that it wasn't this shock that there might be other people migrating to the New World as well. Here are the verses in question. This comes, of course, from the book of Omni, in which there's only 1 chapter. Behold, it came to pass that Mosiah discovered that the people of Zarahemla came out from Jerusalem at the time that Zedekiah, king of Judah, was carried away captive into Babylon. And they journeyed in the wilderness and were brought by the hand of the Lord across the great waters into the land where Mosiah discovered them, and they had dwelt there from that time forth. That's it. It's almost like a shrug of casual indifference, right? Not this like mind-blowing exclamation that there's this realization that another group has come and been led to the same land, right? As like Nibley says, it's just like, oh yeah, there's another group here, whatever. But what's more interesting to me is the description that follows in immediately the next verse 17. And at the time that Mosiah discovered them, they had become exceedingly numerous. Nevertheless, they had had many wars and serious contentions, and had fallen by the sword from time to time, and their language had been corrupted, and they had brought no records with them, and they denied the being of their creator. And Mosiah, nor the people of Mosiah, could understand them. Now, Mulek's group left Jerusalem only a few years after Lehi's family fled, right? Yet when they all joined up in Zarahemla, Mulek's group was observed to be, quote, exceedingly numerous, which I surmise to mean by contrast with the Nephites. So, same numbers of people roughly. There could have been way more people in the original Mulek group, which would allow, them to grow. But by contrast, potentially to the Nephites, the Mulekites, are exceedingly numerous. And then in the course of over about 4 centuries, this entire group is now speaking a language that is unintelligible to the Nephites. And you might think, if you read that next clause in the verse, right, and they had brought no records with them, you might say, oh, well, that's because they didn't have records to reinforce their language, to help teach them to their kids through written language. But I don't think that answer flies, because all throughout world history, there have been all kinds of illiterate societies that have preserved their language. Think of Iceland, for example, geographically isolated. They've had a very slow evolution of their language, which traces back to like the 9th century Old Norse. And that language has been really preserved and evolved very slowly, not because they they, did or did not have written records, but because of the isolation, right? The people of Zarahemla speaking a foreign language as a group, as an entire group, right? It's not like parts of the group. It's like the whole group is now speaking a different language, and no one in Mosiah's camp with the Nephites can understand them. To me, that's a strong indicator that they had embraced the culture and the tongue, the language of another people, which led to the rapid evolution of their own language or total abandonment. Like one argument could be that Mulek's group was so tiny in a much bigger group that they all then just learned that other language and then abandoned, right, their own. Or it could be a rapid evolution of a mixed people and kind of integrating two languages into one or whatever. So I think it's another example where it's far more likely to have happened that way, to become exceedingly numerous and to have a totally different language in that span of time if you are integrating with a different society. Okay, let's wrap up with the Nephites. So right after Nephi's death, his younger brother Jacob delivers a sermon to his people. He's denouncing their vanity, their pride, their whoredoms. Now recall who followed Nephi, right? After he decided to flee Laman and Lemuel and the brothers of Ishmael or Ishmael's sons, right? So who follows Nephi? It's his brothers Sam, Jacob, and Joseph, and then his sisters. Okay, it doesn't say how many. Let's just assume he's got 3 sisters. Zoram, and then all of their spouses. So if we assume 3 sisters, that's 8 couples total. And then assuming 2 generations, right, by the time of Nephi's death, and an average of 5 children from every single couple, we're looking at about 150 people by the time Nephi has died, okay? So Nephite society, at the time of his death, when Jacob is taking over, roughly 150 people. But by the time of his death, it says that there had been, Nephi said, quote, wars and contentions and destructions, in which he had wielded the sword of Laban in their defense. So in those 2 generations of time, there had been battles in which some, potentially many, of the Nephite men had died, okay, which would have reduced the number of that population. So the total potential number with our assumptions is 156. So let's take it down to maybe 100, right? Because some of the men who died in the first generation could therefore not procreate, and then that would, deprive the next 2 generations of proportionally more people with all the births. Okay, so we're talking about 100 people, right? And yet Jacob in chapter 2 rebukes his people for lusting after many wives and concubines, pursuing their polygamous whoredoms that God considered abominable. That's what chapter 2 is heavily focusing on. Now, in my mind, that suggests a much larger population of females to draw from than could have been the case with only the surviving posterity amongst 100 people over the course of 2 generations, for them to be able to entertain and actually practice not just a wife here and there, but many wives and concubines. That implies a larger female population, which in my mind implies an indigenous existing society from which to draw that number of people. And then think of Sherem. So here's another example. This is just a few years after Jacob's sermon. It says, there came a man among the people of Nephi whose name was Sherem. And so this guy Sherem tells Jacob that he had sought much opportunity that I might speak unto you, for I have heard, and I also know that thou goest about much, preaching that which ye call the gospel or the doctrine of Christ. So again, if the population at the time is 100 to 150, somewhere in there, right? That's a tiny village at most. Jacob is their spiritual teacher now. He would have had regular contact with everyone in the community, a very visible presence, right? Everyone would know everyone else in a community this tiny. And yet, how would it be possible that Sherem had never seen Jacob? And why would he have persisted so long in trying to make contact with him? And then also, where would Jacob go about preaching, as Sherem said, if the group was so small? That implies a voyage, a travel, a journey of some kind to go about preaching, right? And then from where did Sherem, quote, come among the people of Nephi? So you might say, well, maybe he was a Lamanite, right? Maybe he's coming from the Lamanite branch of the family. And I think that's unlikely because Sherem acknowledged that he believed in the scriptures and therefore the law of Moses when he was asked by Jacob. Jacob asks him, believest thou in the scriptures? He says, yes. That wasn't really a Lamanite tradition at all. They kind of completely abandoned that. We have no indication that they were teaching their children and then their grandchildren of the second generation down here about Sherem or about the gospel. So in my mind, Sherem's not a Lamanite. I think the story makes way more sense if Nephi's people were surrounded by and they had become integrated into a populace that was already there, which would swell their numbers significantly more. It would give Jacob much more people to go out and preach to and visit the countryside. And, oh, there's my third cousin who intermarried with that local gal. And, he's trying to be shacking up with 8 other girls, like all that kind of stuff. In my mind, makes way more sense that there's already, a lot of people here. There's, a sole reference in the book of Alma, chapter 19, to Lamanitish women. That doesn't exist anywhere in the Book of Mormon. So part of me is like, okay, could that mean like a mixed race, like part Lamanite, but part indigenous type thing, right? Maybe that's what Lamanitish women means. I also think of Nephi and his people building a massive structure. He says, like unto the Temple of Solomon, thinking just of the logistics of that for acquiring the materials, the coordination of labor. So in my mind, as I read this kind of in between the lines, what I think is missing in the Book of Mormon is this explicit acknowledgement of existing people and people who had come before, and maybe the point was valid that the first presidency guy, Ivan, said, like, maybe it was unknown to the authors of the book. Maybe they just weren't aware of, I don't know. Because if they were all intermarrying and moving, I think they would have been very aware of what was happening. But to me, it solves for this conundrum of like, how is it that these people were growing so large in their populations, despite starting with so few people, and then constantly having wars and battles and all these things. And then getting back to the topic that launched this whole question for me, how is it that the children of Lehi and Jared and his family and their posterity are all becoming so corrupt with their own slow stain of the world? It wasn't just from their internal corruption, right? People abandoning the faith or pursuing false ideas. That was definitely a part. I'm not saying that's not an element. It definitely is. But to me, it makes way more sense if the pattern we see with the children of Israel was replicated here in the New World, right? Think real quick in wrapping up of the olive tree allegory in Jacob 5, right? Branches were broken off of the tame tree, which was historical Israel. And these tame branches were grafted onto the wild trees, the non-Israelite groups, with the young and tender branches joining into the existing wild trees in the nethermost parts of the vineyard. So the Lord, through this allegory, is making clear that these branches will be taken from the house of Israel, like the Jaredites and the Mulekites and the Lehiites, and they will be grafted into existing wild trees in the nethermost parts of the vineyard. Hey, I'm going to send you to the other side of the world. There's already rotten trees bearing wild, corrupt fruit. I'm going to graft you into them. It's not just I'm going to plant you in this, open soil. It's this grafting into other parts of the vineyard, which to me is another example of, no, there were existing people here. This wasn't the Jaredites in isolation or the Nephite / Lamanites in isolation. They were dealing with a lot of other, to me, that also solves for the whole DNA thing. And everyone's like, oh, whatever, right? I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. But the point is, like, if these groups were a tiny blip, a drip in an ocean of people that were here from other migrations and across, the different connections of land and sea and all over the place, right? They could have had far greater growth of population. And then these peoples are all moving and intermarrying and intermingling. And the bloodline and the DNA and everything else of the Nephites and the Jaredites, well, they all basically died off. But, the Nephites / Mulekites could be just heavily watered down by so many other people, and therefore difficult or impossible at this late stage to find. Like these issues kind of resolve themselves for me when realizing it's not what many people long ago suspected, that all of the American Indians are ancestors of, this group, but rather that these groups in the Book of Mormon were minority populations in a much bigger society. And to me, it kind of addresses and solves for some of these things. They face the same challenge of having to avoid the corruption and the pagan influences and apostasy and everything of surrounding people and their attractive women and their, lust for power and riches and all the things, just like the children of Israel. That to me makes for a far more interesting experience for them here in the Americas if they weren't in a vacuum, in isolation, but they were having to figure out the same things we are, that we're not in a vacuum. We're not living amongst our own utopian society or whatever, right? We struggle with the same thing that the Israelites did and the Nephites did. Then I can read those lessons and I can better apply them in my own life and ponder how were they dealing with that? What were their struggles? What went wrong? What can I avoid, right? By reading from their stories and trying to learn from their mistakes. So curious to know, had you ever encountered this concept before? As I said, I hadn't really thought about this in years until I started writing this. And then I was reflecting on what was that slow stain of the world impacting the Nephites. And then I was like, well, wait a minute, it's not just their own corruption. They had the same problem coming at them from all sides, I think, from surrounding society. So then I started writing on it, thought I'd do a musing on it, but I'm curious, had you heard about that topic before? Are there other scriptural examples or stories that I missed that you feel like demonstrates what I'm talking about? As I said, reading between the lines, this isn't overall a super critical thing to have any kind of belief in, but to me, it makes the story far more interesting and relatable to my own life and explains some of these situations in the scriptures in a way that I think gives them more meaning and context. So curious to know in the comments what you think. Hope you guys have a great Sunday, and I'll see you next week.